Laura pulled her cell phone out of its storage compartment and queued up the first video before wondering if she really should watch it again. They had, technically, only been in space for 8 hours with another 72 yet to go, and she'd already viewed the 3-minute clip close to 100 times. The little voice in the back of her head that said she would tire of it if she continued at her current pace was quickly silenced, however, once play was pressed yet again.
Hi, Mommy.
Kevin, who just turned 6 a week ago, smiled and waved at the camera while hovering over the birthday cake which Mike had decorated with stars, planets, and a tiny replica of the Olympus space station.
I love you,
he continued.
We both love you.
Mike called out from behind the camera.
Tell your mommy what you're getting ready to do.
Kevin nodded, commiserative approval, his smile contagious. Laura, as with each watching, smiled as well.
I'm going to blow out my candles.
Her son brushed the hair from his eyes. Mike always let him slack on the haircuts when she wasn't there, and puffed his cheeks in anticipation of a large enough exhalation to extinguish 6 candles. Before he had a chance to blow, however, Mike caught him with another question, earning something of a perturbed expression for his efforts.
Why are you blowing out candles?
Kevin's perturbed expression shifted to one of outright incredulity, seemingly the dumbest question he'd ever heard. The boy shrugged and threw up his arms.
Because they're on fire, Daddy.
His tone was deadpan serious, bringing involuntary laughter from both his dad, who was there, and his mom, who wanted to be there more than anything. It broke her heart to think of the special days she had missed spending with her husband and child, the birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries, but that was part of a price that they all, as a family, agreed to. The bottom line was that they were both so proud of her, those things were easily forgiven. Most 6-year-olds would throw a fit if their mother didn't attend their surprise birthday party, but Kevin spent his bragging to the invited classmates about his amazing mom, Laura Hillman, the astronaut.
No, silly,
Mike corrected the boy.
Tell your mom why you're blowing out these candles. Oh yeah,
Kevin finally understood.
This is a super special cake that's just for us. Because the other one got eaten up at the party,
Mike added, his voice louder than the boy's given his proximity to the microphone. Kevin laughed in agreement.
Yeah, I only got one piece. But that's okay, because we got this one for you, me, and Mommy. And Daddy says that this video will make it like you were here too, and that I should tell you I'm telling the camera,
Kevin tied his own tongue momentarily.
It's okay, buddy,
Mike prompted.
She knows what you mean. I think you probably need to go ahead and make your wish. The candles are getting a little low there.
With wax coming dangerously close to frosting, Laura's child, and despite all of her accomplishments, the best thing she had ever done, puffed his cheeks once again, blew them out with only the tiniest degree of spittle release. Mike kept the footage running as Kevin cut the first and largest piece, which they set aside for her. It was to be freeze-dried and sent overnight to Russia, where it would be included with the supply manifest for the ESA's automated transfer vehicle launching with the Ariane 6 heavy lift rocket, exactly 13 hours after Laura and Dmitri's Orion capsule, the Daedalus, lifted off from the Cape Canaveral. If it all went according to plan, in 3 days' time, we would be able to sit down in her own private quarters aboard the OSS and eat a portion of the triple chocolate cake while, most likely, watching this video again for the 1,000th time. Mike set the camera down on the kitchen table and directed it so that she could see both of the men in her life enjoying their cake together, repeating, "It's good," and to each other. When Kevin was down to a few bites, Mike drew his attention to some tiny detail in the frosting that the boy couldn't quite see. Urging him closer and closer, her husband was somehow able to pull off the oldest gag in the book and mush Kevin's face into the cake, smearing his nose and cheeks with chocolate. Laura's son was a rare breed, who thought of other people first and practically never harbored ill will, and his reaction of laughter, and then hamming it up even more for the camera, was exactly what she would have expected it to be. Every parent wanted to say that they had a good kid, but in her case, well, she had a good kid. The video would close with a clean face and Kevin offering up the sacred secrecy of his birthday wish without provocation.
"You don't have to say it if you don't want to,"
Mike had assured him, but his son insisted. Adamant about the fact that the wish was coming true regardless, the boy felt strongly that her knowing about it would help to keep Mommy safe. In the final seconds of the video, with Mike's strong arm around the kid, Kevin looks first at the camera, then back at his father before saying with complete sincerity,
"My wish is for Mommy to get to the Olympic Stadium, okay?"
It was incredibly sweet, and also very unfortunate that the clip ended when it did, because she would have loved to have seen the look on Mike's face. It didn't matter how many times they had told their son that it was the Olympus station. It almost always came back to them as the Olympic Stadium. It had gotten so many laughs out of them. At this point, the kid was probably doing it on purpose. Laura sighed and switched off her iPhone before slipping it back into the console. She might not get tired of watching videos of her home, but her battery would. It amazed her. The Daedalus was equipped with some of the most advanced circuitry in the world, and yet they couldn't have put a USB port. Admittedly, the Orion series weren't exactly designed for luxury travel. Utilitarian in nature, the capsules were created for transporting goods and supplies, and in this particular instance, they were the goods. The astronauts, cosmonauts, and French spationauts that used the 4- and 2-man capsules weren't exactly boxed away like cargo. They weren't flying first class either, or even coach for that matter. Comfort seemed to come very low on the list of specifications the various agencies used in their creation. Significantly lower, at least, than things like hull integrity and oxygen stability. Keeping them alive seemed to be of higher priority than reclining seats in an in-flight movie. She wasn't complaining. She looked over at Dmitri, who was sound asleep, and found it remarkable that he could do so with such ease. While they had specific sleep cycles that they would try to adhere to, Laura had been unable to catch a single week during the first 4-hour shift. There had been too much adrenaline surging through her system to even make it possible. It felt like too many double espressos. She was in space, dreaming of this moment since she was Kevin's age. It was the fruition of everything she had ever wanted growing up. Her high school yearbook quote was, "If I get to space, I will die happy," and she meant it. Breaking through the cloud line, leaving the atmosphere behind and delving into the unimaginable vastness was like nothing she had imagined, and nothing like the simulations either. It was a rush. Giving birth to Kevin, marrying Mike, graduating to a gold key NASA astronaut. These had been the defining moments in her life, and now they all just seemed to pale by comparison. She would leave that part out when relaying the story to her boys. Her co-pilot, however, did not appear to be as impressed. Dmitri Vladimir Kapersky had a few more seasons under his belt than she did, as a pilot cosmonaut and a test cosmonaut, on 39 different missions to space, including 2 two-year stints aboard the now-defunct International Space Station. The man had logged more time in space than anyone who hadn't retired, which was part of the reason why he was being made the commander of the OSS. Dmitri had the type of serious temperament and fastidious eye for detail that only came from being in the game for so long. Most people that met him once thought he was a hard-ass, but once you really got to know him, well, he was still a hard-ass. But he was honest, and brave, and intelligent, and frankly, there was no one else you'd rather have watching your back. Laura had first met the revered cosmonaut 12 years ago, when she took an 8-week course he was instructing, and he had intimidated the hell out of her at that time. He had seen something in her, however, and 2 weeks into the program, pulled her aside out of nearly 300 people who all had the same dream of being an astronaut or cosmonaut and told her, "You're going to space." Unbeknownst to her, he had followed her career after that, and it was he who put in the request to have her on the station crew. Laura knew he had given a recommendation, but had no idea the extent to which he was responsible for her wildest dreams coming true. In 3 days' time, the adventure would really begin. Dmitri would be replacing current OSS commander Jill Milner. and Laura was relieving Alex Wang, both of whom would use the Daedalus to return to Earth after completing 4-year tours in space. Astronauts Nick Geary and Rukia Kanagi would be staying behind, leaving a continued skeleton crew of 4 once the Daedalus departs again. Theirs would be the final preparations that would need to be made in advance of the full crew arrival in 3 months' time. The Olympus space station was a masterpiece of civil engineering and deep space construction, created as a long-term alternative to the archaic tin can known as the International Space Station. Built to comfortably house a working community of 288 people, Laura's team was responsible for a large variety of nitpicking tasks, from inputting personal and medical data of all the incoming personnel to testing every system available to test. They would have their hands full, no doubt. The heavy lifting had already been done. Dmitri would be the first OSS commander to maintain the station at capacity, and she would be one of the flight crew. It was all very exciting. Laura wasn't the only one to have high hopes for Olympus. The crew were coming from every corner of the world and through every space agency available, including private companies like SpaceX. There was a real emphasis on global cooperation and working together, and it was hoped by many in America at least that the station would act as a beacon for the rest of the world to follow. There was a quiet optimism that the glorious utopia of collaboration orbiting above the rest of humanity might somehow ebb the rising tide of hatred and violence spilling over all borders. Since the beginning of the nuclear age, the threat of mutual destruction has been the only thing keeping the peace between nations, supposedly. It now seemed, however, that the world was evolving into a different place with a different mindset. There were countries in the world with egomaniacal leaders who cared more about power than their citizens, and some who were even worse, some that cared only for destruction. There were factions of generational wealthy who funneled ungodly amounts of money into creating propaganda, distrust, riots, and eventually, war. To these people, war equals money. They just don't seem to understand that the world has the capacity for only one more war. At the very bottom of the pyramid was the majority of the planet's 7.5 billion people. And those people were completely terrified, wanting nothing more than peace. Part of the reason Laura finally decided to actually go into space and leave her family behind on terra firma was the hope that she was working to create a better world for her son than the one he currently resided in. With no eye for politics or the law, the only way she knew how to do that was through science, and the idea that global resolution could come through mankind experiencing and thriving far beyond the bounds of any country or even the world itself. She didn't know if her co-pilot and future commander was going to Olympus for the same lofty idealisms that drove her, however. It was hard to say how he felt about the future of the planet or even being unmarried and without children, his desire to be on it. Heart-to-hearts weren't exactly his strong suit. Motivations aside, there could not have been a better person available for the position. Dmitri snorted loudly, breaking the silence of the capsule and causing Laura to jump in her seat, startling her from her thoughts. The older man wasn't a snorer, thank goodness. That could have been maddening. But he did, on occasion, release an involuntary snort which, when it didn't scare her half to death, tickled her to no end. She had heard a rumor in flight school that he once had the nickname Hot Sauce, but she was never able to verify its authenticity, let alone find out how he might have gotten it. Presumably, it had something to do with hot sauce. Hopefully for eating it. She watched him for a moment to see if the splitter was a solo. Sometimes they came in pairs, and when she was satisfied that there wasn't another one coming, she turned her attention to the beveled window known as the Viewpoint 6. The motion wasn't terribly comfortable, as she had to twist her neck somewhat to look over her right shoulder, but it was the only one of the 6 openings that provided her with a view of Earth which was, for all intents and purposes, in their rearview mirror. The windows were actually 3 different frames of aluminum silicate infused glass, with the center pane adjusting for the dramatic difference in pressure between the vacuum of space and what they needed to survive the trip. So the view provided wasn't crystal clear. That being said, it was still a breathtaking sight to behold. Almost as if Mother Nature had coordinated for her benefit alone, the cloud cover was practically non-existent, Even at the distance they had already traveled, the outline of the North and South American landmasses were clearly discernible in the sunlight-bathed side of the Earth, brown and green against the brilliant blues and aquamarines of the ocean. They had, of course, traveled too far to make out any of the footprints of mankind, cities, monuments, and the like, or so she thought. A flash of blinding light from somewhere on the US East Coast flared out as bright as the sun, leaving spots on the back of her eyelids when she reflexively squeezed them shut. Her first thought was that it had to be weather-related, but logic quickly dictated that couldn't be the case. It was way too bright to have been anything like lightning, which shouldn't be observable from space anyway. Could it have been a reflection of the sun's light? A basic understanding of geometrics and the sun's current location made that highly improbable. Laura's mind was running through the logical possibilities to the point of even considering breaking Dmitri's slumber early for his opinion, when the communication channel designated Tango began flashing on the digital dashboard. It was accompanied by its own unique beep, and the moment it went off, Dmitri woke up anyway, constantly tuned in. It was an alarm we weren't used to, and probably shouldn't be hearing. There was their main line of communications, Alpha, which was the direct contact with their mission control at NASA in Cape Canaveral, Florida. They had regularly planned interactions, but it wasn't completely uncommon for either side to relay messages outside of the scheduled check-ins. Beta was a backup comm channel, which also linked to mission control in the unlikely scenario that the main line became compromised. Once you got past the first two channels, you had a dozen more which were direct lines to various space agencies' mission controls around the planet. Tango was so far down the list of probable contact that Laura had actually forgotten whom it connected to, having not used it since the early days of training. Not surprisingly, Dmitri knew immediately, as he switched off the alarm and connected to the European Space Agency's mission control in Darmstadt, Germany. "This is Daedalus," Dmitri began, his English thick with a Russian accent. Pulling up the confirmation codes needed for an unscheduled transmission from his console screen, he continued. "Confirmation. Echo, Rainbow, Straw Hat, 7-4, Razor Blade."
Daedalus, there's a problem.
The unidentified person on the other end cut him off, seemingly unconcerned about national security since Dmitri still had 4 more verification words left to go.
We're getting reports. God. I don't even know how to.
The man's voice seemed strained and disconnected at the time, tones they weren't used to hearing from their earthly contacts, who were trained to maintain calming dispositions when dealing with their counterparts in space. The capsule mates shared a bewildered look before Dmitri tried again. "ESA. Why are you guys contacting us?" His best guess was that they had some atmospheric questions or numbers for Daedalus to run for the unmanned supply launch that should be taking place within the hour. Perhaps an update on the launch itself. "Was there something we can help you guys with?" There was an extended silence, which was also unusual. Finally,
Daedalus, when did you last report to NASA Mission Control? How long has it been?
it was Laura who replied. "Approximately 40 minutes ago. Due for next communication at 0900 hours. The ESA rep left them with an extended silence yet again, and this time it was long enough for Dmitri to say, "Screw this. Pull up the Alpha channel as well. Mission Control, this is Daedalus, do you read?" There's no reply. And after a few minutes he tried again. "Mission Control, this is Daedalus, do you read?"
You're not getting anything, are you?
asked the ESA line, who had been listening the entire time. "What the hell's going on, ESA?" Laura blurted. They were both getting a little irritated with the situation. The astronauts could hear the man sigh and then begin talking to someone else that wasn't them. It was mostly muffled, but small bits of phrases would make their way through the unscathed, like, "have to tell," "what if it's true," and "better off than we are," before finally speaking in a voice clear enough that it was obvious he was speaking to them again.
"Dmitri, Laura, this is coming strictly outside of the chain of command and..."
Again the line went quiet, and the informal nature of the way they were being addressed was alone enough to find quite disconcerting. They both had code names that were to be used during transit. Once aboard the OSS, NASA or anyone else that wanted to make contact would be fine in calling them by their birth names. It was protocol, however. During the actual flights, he would be referred to as Handlebar, and she was Teacup. It was highly unusual to hear her real name coming from the tiny speakers in her in-flight suit, when she had been hearing Teacup since day one of the mission's training period, and it made her squirm uncomfortably, strapped into her seat. "What the hell is going on there, ESA?" Dmitri blurted out, seeming to recognize the difference between the intentional silence and signable tangibility, which Laura was suspecting. The voice, with German inflections, finally replied, but not before they could both hear a blood-curdling cry coming from somewhere else behind him. It was enough to send shivers down both their spines as they looked at each other, searching one another's face for any sign of understanding, each hoping the other might have figured out what was happening.
"I'm sorry, guys. Things are going to hell right now. This is Dolph Wiener."
They had both worked closely with the man in the past, and it was somewhat surprising that neither of them had recognized his voice, but, thick in panic, it was undeniably different now. Dolph, much like Dmitri, was very well respected for his experience and tenure in the space and aeronautics fields. Cutting his teeth at NASA, straight out of MIT, he bounced between the government sectors and private corporations, like Northrop Grumman and Boeing, before finally ending up with the ESA as its mission control director for the sunset years of his distinguished career. For someone of his caliber to be the one establishing contact was just wrong.
"I don't want to be telling you this, but somebody has to. Things have gone to shit down here. It's war. The big one. I think NASA is gone."
Dmitri struggled to grasp what Dolph was trying to tell them, but Laura immediately thought of the flash and knew. "Gone." Dmitri's voice was confused. "What do you mean, gone?"
"Nukes, Dmitri. The bastards are all using."
The signal went dead, its light extinguishing as well as to signify that the man hadn't just stopped mid-sentence. Laura twisted her head back to viewpoint 6 and released a horrible scream that echoed off the capsule walls long after it ended in a tormented moan. It had only been a split second. In that minuscule moment of time that her eyes were open and facing the glass, they were bombarded with a series of simultaneous flashes, so bright it seemed as the Earth had, in fact, become the sun itself. The scream was one of physical agony and not all pertaining to the emotional anguish which was far from setting in. Even though her brain had realized what was happening, the thoughts of her husband and child being burned away to a pile of nuclear ash, or even worse, living through the blasts, hadn't set in yet. The shock of being so suddenly and completely blinded kept everything else at bay. With quicker thinking than Laura displayed, Dmitri activated the solar shield, which blocked very nearly all outside light with the type of tint one could watch a solar eclipse through, and unlatched himself from the seat to set about doing whatever he could to treat her eyes. Although neither of them were doctors, it wasn't as if they were without medical training altogether. Every person that went into space, especially those expecting extended stays, were required to learn just about everything first-year med students were taught. Laura's entire body vibrated with involuntary shaking, a physical reaction to the trauma of having her eyes open and not seeing anything but the assortment of flashing spots, over and over again. At the periphery there seemed to be some acuity, but if she shifted her gaze to any area she thought she might have taken in a small bit of Dmitri's movements, it was filled with the disruptive optical echo. In the thousands of times she had been required to spend extended time in the tiny cramped spaces that being an astronaut required, she had never once experienced any claustrophobia, and now, without warning, Laura was overwhelmed with the sensation of being trapped in her own body, Struggling for breath, she was vaguely aware of her co-pilot's voice doing the best it could to calm her histrionics, but it was distant and foreign. The visual barrier somehow reaching into her mind to affect her cognitive abilities. It took several long minutes, and his placing a medicated bandage over her eyes for his words to slowly sift into any recognizable form of communication. Solar retinopathy. No, it's terrifying. Not permanent. He placed one large palm on her forehead with his fingers drifting into her hairline, and something about the warmth and pressure of it eased the hyperventilation and calmed the tremors from her body, much as Dmitri had intended it to. It brought back warm and comforting memories of her father, who used to do the same thing when she was a small child. Once we get aboard Olympus, we'll be able to treat it better. And you could be seeing fine in just a few weeks. Laura nodded her head to convey that she not only heard the statement, but also that she was back in the realm of clinical response, and Dmitri seemed to understand its meaning. Good, he continued. Okay, listen. I need you to keep your eyes closed for now and do your best to stay calm. He sighed in a way she didn't think she'd ever heard before, and finally asking, Does it hurt? She nodded. The two small bonfires beneath her eyelids kept her from little more than a responsive state, while the shock momentarily held the rest of reality at bay. She could hear him rummaging through something, airtight foil being removed, while she concentrated on the burning and flashing lights that inundated her optical nerves beneath closed and covered eyes. In a moment, his voice had returned to her side. I'm going to give you a fentanyl dose. She nodded again, and when he gently slid the plastic tip of the nasal applicator for the synthetic opioid into her right nostril, he said, On 3. 1, 2, 3. Dmitri squeezed the bottle as Laura inhaled deeply, and the medication began to do its thing almost immediately. Within 30 seconds, she was granted relief with the sweet embrace of darkness offered by unconsciousness. Shortly after that, she found herself in the loving arms of Mike, with Kevin desperately trying to squirm his way from between them. The three of them were in the double king canopied bed that Mike had insisted they spend too much money on, wrestling and tickling each other and reveling in the unabashed and unrestrained joy of being a family in love, and of being all together, which was truly a rare thing. Kevin would pretend to try to get away, but only so much as to reposition himself at an angle to get at her weak spot, between the ribs, just below the armpits. The child was getting stronger every year, but with Mike's assistance, they were able to keep in between them and smothered with kisses. It was a moment that they would have all been happy to have last forever. It didn't. In unison, Mike and Kevin quit laughing and sat upright in the bed, smiles completely erased. Her husband and child each turned to face her, and the expressions of fear etched upon their faces were enough for her to bolt upright as well. Perhaps it was a reaction to Kevin taking her hand or Mike saying, I love you both so much. But the fear they seemed to be feeling gripped her by the throat as well. Suddenly terrified by the certain knowledge that some impending doom was imminent, all she had time to do was shed a single tear when the bay window flooded the room with blinding and oppressive light. It consumed them, and the smell of burning hair filled her nostrils before the wall of fire came through to wash them away. It was a momentary relief when the psychological sledgehammer of a dream jerked her back to a waking state, but the moment was short-lived. Discovering yet again that she had been blinded, hopefully temporarily, the reality of her situation setting back in was just as horrific as the dream had been. She could hear Dmitri, and he was speaking to someone.
I'm telling you, there's nothing.
It was Rukia Kanagi's voice. Dmitri was communicating with the OSS.
We've scanned the entire planet, sir. There are no signals of any type. We've gone over every known man-made frequency in the database. I think... Oh dear Lord, I don't even want to say it out loud.
Rukia was a communications expert, among other things, and she wasn't exactly known for her emotional outbursts. It's okay, Kanagi, Dmitri offered, using a voice with the same calming qualities he used on Laura. You don't have to say it. There were a few minutes of silence, and Laura wondered if she would let them know that she was awake when Rukia's voice filtered through the speakers in her flight suit again.
Sir, given everything that's just happened, I'm uncertain about bringing this up, but
Her voice became conspiratorial.
I think there might be another problem that you need to know about.
Go ahead, Kannagi, he pressed,
Well,
still at a whisper.
it's been nothing more than talk at this point, but, well, I thought you should know. It's Alex and Nick. Jeez, I can't believe I'm even having to say this, but they've been trying to convince the commander that we shouldn't let the Daedalus dock with Olympus.
What the fuck are you talking about, Kannagi? Laura cringed involuntarily. She had never heard Dmitri cuss before. She could only imagine what Rukia's reaction was. It took a moment for her to respond.
Sir, I can't stress enough that they're simply suggesting it as a hypothetical. I know these people, and I can't imagine that they'd really do it. It's just, well, right now the food supplies are somewhat low. Even with reduced rations, there's really only enough for 4 people to survive for a few months. Everything that we needed to keep a continued supply of food was supposed to be on the Arion 6. All the seeds for crops and enough MREs to last 300 people a decade were on that supply ship. And, well, we've not been able to verify if she got off the ground before the shit hit the fan. Until it clears the Van Allen belts, we're not going to be able to lock on to her signal, and that won't be for another 6 hours, assuming she's even out there.
Rukia went quiet again, and Dmitri considered her words before asking. So what are you saying, Kannagi? Is it that the Ariane never made it liftoff, and they're not going to let the Daedalus board the station?
I'm so sorry, sir.
Dmitri could tell the young Japanese-American astronaut was sickened by her own words.
According to Nick, the current supplies would last 6 people no more than a couple weeks. I don't know what to say, sir, except I will die before I let that happen. You have my word. I have to go before they discover that I've contacted you. Maintain your course, and the second I can, I'll give you an update. Godspeed, sir.
Kannagi. Dmitri caught her before she cut the transmission.
Yes, sir.
Kannagi. Rukia. Your father would have been proud of you. Laura could hear the other woman's breath hitch quietly, just short of an actual sob. It was a noise she often made herself when she needed to keep her composure in a haze of emotion. Although it was customary for commanding officers to refer to their crew by their secondary names, Dmitri had been doing it his entire career. It was a rare treat to hear the first name coming from his lips.
Thank you, sir.
Olympus cut the connection, and after a moment of quiet, Dmitri turned his attention to his bandaged co-pilot. You had nothing to add to the conversation, Hillman. She smiled despite the grave situation. The man never ceased to amaze her. How did you know I was awake? Her voice was dry and cracked, and before she could ask for water, he had positioned the flight suit's drinking tube into her mouth. The water tasted fine, even though she couldn't help but to think about the fact that a portion of it was her own reconstituted urine, much as she did every time she drank. The flight suits were equipped with 10 gallons of water and an advanced filtration system for the astronauts' urine, which would stretch the 10 gallons into the 50 or 60 that they would need to stay hydrated on the trip to Olympus. You're breathing, he answered her question as she drank. Is it true? She asked after finally satiating her thirst. Is it all gone? Dmitri shook his head despite her inability to see it. I don't know. I think it would be unwise for either of us to make any assumptions. But you tried all the channels? While you slept, yeah. I've scanned every frequency this little Orion capsule is capable of. That being said, we can't afford to lose ourselves in hypothetical conjecture. Dwelling on what happened down there isn't going to help us any up here. All we need to concentrate on is getting on the OSS. She was incapable of taking that advice, and her brain vomited up the thought it had been tiptoeing around for as long as it could. Oh, God. Mike. Kevin. She felt the already weak grasp on her sanity slipping away as the notion of a rest of her life without her husband and child tried to take hold. Dmitri grabbed her shoulders and gently shook her, hoping to bring her attention back to the here and now. No, he screamed into her face. You cannot do that right now. His voice was compassionate but forceful at the same time. For one, you can't cry if you want your eyes to heal. There's no way around that. If something did happen to your family, then there will be time to mourn them later. On Olympus. Right now, I'm giving you a direct command. You are not to think about the conditions on Earth while you are aboard the Daedalus. Do you understand? Technically, he wasn't her commanding officer until they were aboard the OSS, and he had relieved Commander Milner of the position, but she knew what he was doing. And more importantly, he was right. Nodding again, she did her best to wipe the anguished look from her face. The new one wasn't a whole lot better, but Dmitri could see the determination Laura was trying to convey. He could trust that she was, once again, a competent co-pilot. It wouldn't be slipping back into hysterics of any type. Not yet, anyway. Although it took several long seconds, she somehow managed to compartmentalize the pain into a spot where it could be relatively ignored for the time being. It was an ability that she wasn't aware she had, and that wasn't necessarily a good thing. Yes, sir, she finally managed. And then, after a few more seconds, what about the Ariane 6? What about it? She wasn't exactly sure what she was asking either. I don't know, is there any way that we can track her? We're a lot closer to it than Olympus. Dmitri shook his head, before yet again realizing that her condition made it moot to do so. Not without knowing her flight plan. She's unmanned, so there's nothing more than a beacon, and without mission control to give us coordinates, well, the answer's no. Olympus will find her before we ever could. And all we can do now is continue on with our flight plan. Without her eyes, Laura found herself concentrating on the timbre and cadence of the man's voice, more than she ever had before, and there were no cracks. Still calm, still in control, and still working the problem with a thorough logic that she couldn't hope to achieve given the circumstances. Laura knew her life was in his hands, and she was grateful. Do you really think they'll exile the Daedalus? It seemed unimaginable, but then again, so did this entire situation. No, I do not. She could hear the certainty in his voice. How can you be so sure? Because I know Kanagi and Commander Milner won't let it happen. Wang and Giri had a knee-jerk reaction. Panic and fear makes some men revert to base instincts, but they will come to their senses. It's been my experience that those who make it to space generally have a strong reverence for life. Okay, I believe you. And she did. They sat in silence for 30 minutes before Dmitri broke out their meal injections. Being that a toilet was one of the amenities the Daedalus lacked, solid food consumption was out of the question. A pre-launch colon cleanse combined with the injections that contained all the vitamins, proteins, and nutrients their bodies required made the process possible. Which wasn't to say that it was pleasant in the least. Several days of tapering off the injections and slowly reintroducing food to the system was required afterwards, and it could be several weeks before your stomach was ready for a spicy burrito again. Fortunately, they were privy to the most advanced supplies available, and their nutrient shots came in the MIT-engineered devices which injected their food without needles, delivering a high-velocity jet of liquid that breached the skin at the speed of sound. They included appetite suppressants as well, which kept the tummy from rumbling its disapproval at the unnatural attempt to sustain its needs. Everyone a growing cosmonaut needs to become big and strong, Dmitri said as he depressed the injection into his neck. It was the same thing he said every time they ate. His consistency was doubly reassuring in that moment, and for the upteenth time she thought, thank God for Dmitri. Although he offered, Laura was able to handle her own injection. Ironically, it was just the day before that she told him she could have done it blindfolded, and now it was time to put up or shut up. Dmitri did the honors of cleaning the dishes and informed her that it was time for her sleep. Without her vision to provide a framework of her surroundings, she was losing all sense of time. After the last drug-induced chainsaw of a dream she was in, hurried to return, and put up a bit of a fight as well. After all, he hadn't slept since she had, and they both needed him to be at his best. Or at least, better than he would be if sleep deprivation took hold. Her arguments held no sway, however, and he pulled premature rank on this capsule mate once again. Finally, she agreed. She was tired, but she declined Dmitri's offer of more fentanyl. Her eyes weren't burning nearly as bad now, and frankly, she couldn't take another dream like the last one. Before attempting to sleep, Laura did something she hadn't done since she was a small child. She prayed. It was the first time the adult version of her had done so without feeling like a hypocrite, and it was short, simple request. There were a great many things that probably should have been prayed for more. She knew that, but she only asked for a moment of peace, an opportunity to sleep safe from the torment of her pain. Her prayer was answered. Falling asleep quicker than she thought possible, her mind remained mercifully blank. The burning thoughts she had been holding at bat, the ones that wanted to rip away at her soul, were enveloped and replaced by the soothing balm of utter blackness. It was impossible to say how long she was cradled by the nothingness, but when Dmitri put his hand on her shoulder to wake her, it felt like only a few minutes. When he told her it had been 6 hours, it was a shock, and had it been anyone else, she wouldn't have believed him. He said that he would have let her sleep longer had they not been anticipating an update from Olympus on Arion 6 status. That, and he wanted to change the dressing on her eyes. They were midway through the process of removing the bandage and cleaning her eyes for the new one when Olympus's signal went off. Multitasking, Dmitri switched on the comm and addressed the OSS while the finishing of the task. "Go ahead, Olympus." He stayed somewhat official, unsure if he'd be speaking to Rukia or not.
God, sir.
It was Rukia. She sounded unusually frantic.
Oh God. I can't believe...
"Kannagi," Dmitri barked with authority, pulling the Olympus communications officer back from the edge of panic.
Right, I'm sorry, sir.
Her voice returned to its normal stoic tone.
It's mutiny, sir. Wang and Giri have cordoned the commander to the brig because she refused to side with them regarding the Daedalus.
"You mean us?" Laura asked.
Laura?
"Yeah, Rukia. It's me."
Oh, Laura, I'm so sorry. Commander Kaspersky told me about your eyes. Don't worry, we'll get you fixed up.
It had been a number of years since the women had seen each other, but they had always considered each other friends. "How are we going to do that if we can't come aboard, Rukia?" Silence took a full half-minute from them before Dmitri took control again. "Kannagi, what is your standing with Giri and Wang?"
It's not great, sir.
Dmitri chuckled, seemingly getting the answer he was expecting.
The sons of bitches know I'm not going along with them either, however. It would seem I know Olympus's electrical grid a little better than they do. I've managed to lock myself down in E-Wing, and until the morons figure out how to manually override the door controls, I should be okay. I've rerouted communications in most of the central systems so that I can control them from here.
Dmitri was impressed. For that matter, so was Laura. She had always thought of Rukia Kannagi as a competent scientist and an advanced electrical engineer who most likely had a kind heart, but this fierce loyalty and bravery was really showing her something. In the wake of extreme tragedy, people's true colors were bleeding through facades they liked to present, and Rukia's were downright admirable. "You're a smart girl, Kannagi," Dmitri offered.
Well, sir, I don't know about that. I may have control of the OSS right now, but the one thing I have absolutely none of is food. I've got maybe 4 days tops before I'll have to turn the station back over or risk dying, and having the whole place go down as a result.
"Kannagi, can you control the docking ports from your position?" Laura broke in, and Dmitri, knowing where she was going, nodded in agreement. It was the only way any of them could go without resolving themselves to disagreeable deaths.
That was the entire reason why I stole control of Olympus, Laura. At your current trajectory, you should be here in 56 hours. I'll make it that long. That's not the only problem, though. Even if I get you hooked up at the station, that doesn't mean that I'll be able to keep Giri and Wang from greeting you at the door as you come in.
"You don't need to worry about that, Kannagi." Dimitri's iron tone put it to rest. "All I want you to do is keep yourself safe until we can get there to help you. Do you understand?"
Yes, sir. Commander, sir. I will not let you down.
"I know that, Kannagi. You never have." After a short moment of reflection, as they all instinctively wondered if this communication were between the last friends any of them would ever have again, Dmitri asked, "Do I take this to mean that there's been nothing from the Arion 6?
No, sir.
Rukia lamented, and after a moment,
But that doesn't necessarily mean anything. Without any communications with Earth, well, we just don't know. I tried to explain that to Wang. But with Giri breathing down his neck, he just wouldn't listen. There are a million different things that could have changed about the launch time or flight plan that would affect our ability to locate it. There's no way to know for absolute sure that she's not coming till the damn thing's only 12 hours away or closer. So it'll be, like 2.5 days before I can narrow the search enough to say definitively, one way or the other.
Rukia, Laura piped.
Yeah?
Do Alex and Nick know that you've been in contact with the Daedalus?
Not yet, no. Wang isn't the complete idiot. Geary is, however. It won't be long before he figures out how to, at least, monitor the comm. I'll know if that happens, though, so... Oh, shit.
Rukia cut the communication completely, and Laura's first reaction was to re-establish the channel. Dmitri said no, however, and being blind, there was little she could do about it. What the hell? Laura demanded, serving the dual purpose of questioning both Rukia's abrupt exit, as well as Dmitri's refusal to find out why. A full minute passed without an answer. When she reiterated the question, this time it earned her a shh, like she was a child to be shushed. In any other situation, she might have taken offense, but in this instance, it worked. After a few more minutes of silence, Dmitri said, "It's Morse code." What? Kanagi. She's using the channel's connection light to communicate in Morse code. I thought maybe it was broken, but... Okay, wait. Here's the beginning. Listening. DOCKBAYSIX. She wants us to dock in Bay 6. Dmitri clicked the channel off and on to acknowledge the received message. Shortly after that, the channel opened again.
Daedalus, this is Olympus, do you copy?
It was Rukia again, formal this time.
Daedalus, I have your docking information.
She was obviously attempting the lay of trail of crumbs for Geary and Wang. Roger, Olympus. This is Daedalus. We copy. Laura replied since she was technically the comm officer in the capsule.
Roger that, Daedalus. We've got you docking in Bay 25. Do you copy? Bay 25.
There were only 25 docking bays, so she was giving them as much distance as she could without making it obvious by putting them in the first few bays. Rukia was a really smart girl. Copy that, Olympus. Bay 25. Over and out. Dmitri flipped off the signal and sighed. The next 2 days were going to be that much longer if they'd been unable to speak to Rukia anymore. Unfettered, at least. What had started out as an expedition based in science and the advancement of the species had turned into a Darwinian nightmare where, hopefully, it wouldn't be survival of the fittest, but rather, survival of the smartest, with the advantage of knowing what it was they would be walking into. They had approximately 2 days to formulate a way of making sure they ended up on top. It was Dmitri's contention that there was a significant difference between the two men would do if they actually made it aboard the Olympus. There was more than a fine line between leaving them to their own devices by denying the Daedalus and committing cold-blooded murder in person, and he seemed fairly certain that the Olympus astronauts were incapable of such an act. She wanted to believe him. For Laura, the next 2 days passed like 2 months. She never realized how acutely integrated her sight was with her sense of time. Her inability to monitor the clock and the distance traveled seemed to mess with her sanity more than anything, and it required Dmitri's having to talk her back from the edge more than once. Every 5 hours they changed her bandage, and Dmitri cut his sleep times down to 90-minute intervals. Those hour-and-a-half segments were the worst, teetering on the edge of her seat while he slept, and straining her eyes for any one of the 103 different noises the Daedalus might make to let them know if they were an issue, or if the course needed adjustment. Those short periods felt like days unto themselves, and she was grateful for those rare moments when he would release from one of his sleep snorts. Rather than surprise her like they normally did, they felt like Dmitri's way of saying, "You're okay," while he slept, and brought her back from the sensation that she was all alone and floating aimlessly through space. When they were within 12 hours, it would have been procedure for the OSS to make contact with the Daedalus every 45 minutes, but Olympus made no more contact. Rukia, knowing the gig was up, no longer attempted the routine BS and concentrated solely on her survival. and keeping tabs on astronauts Wang and Geary through the OSS security cameras. At least, that's the message she conveyed in her last Morse code transmission around the 20-hour mark. When they were a mere 4 hours away and riddled with adrenaline-fueled anticipation, they did receive a transmission from Rukia. It was short, and it gave them no time to respond before the connection cut again.
Commander, Laura, they're coming through the door. I can't hold them back any longer. Automated docking routine Epsilon Epsilon 79 Tango. Godspeed.
Dmitri did try to re-establish contact, but this time, there was no raising the station. Rukia had done everything she could to give them a fighting chance of getting aboard the station. The Daedalus was at a decided disadvantage, no doubt. Without someone to make the tiny rotational adjustments to the OSS that were usually needed, not to mention Laura's inability to monitor the capsule's gyroscopic readings, well, Dmitri would have his hands full. What he did have, however, was the exact same pitch and roll the station would be, along with his remarkable gift of being able to fly any vehicle designed for zero gravity with the precision of a machine. From time to time, including his current approach, he was known to say, "Han Solo, eat your heart out." But the Daedalus wasn't exactly the Millennium Falcon, and Laura wasn't sure she wanted to be thought of as Chewbacca. She did her best throaty grrr impression of the Wookiee regardless, and Dmitri unleashed his first authentic laugh since they had left Earth. There wasn't much to it, but it was a moment they both needed, the tension palpable and suffocating. Olympus was enormous. It was the first trip for either of them, and it could be seen by eye at nearly 500 miles. The closer they got, the more Dmitri marveled at its size and struggled to verbally describe it to Laura. Even though he knew specs by heart, it was so much larger in person than he had imagined. At 500 yards, it was like navigating the capsule above a large city, a city which was rotating at 50 miles an hour. Bouncing between his manual controls and Laura's gyro readings, Dmitri was a one-man dynamo, navigating the Daedalus like it was an extension of his own body. He somehow made the piece of unwieldy metal and its 24 opposing jets control like a sleek flying sports car. Even without her eyes, Laura was impressed. Dmitri had to circle the OSS twice in order to bring the Daedalus into alignment with Docking Bay 6, and then rotated an additional 4 more times with the station before making sure the capsule was locked into the magnetic hold with an airtight seal. Once the green light for the first stage of decompression came on, they knew they needed to move quickly. Bay 25 was at the far end of the station, but if Wang and Geary had regained control of the surveillance system, then they probably already knew that they had been fooled. If they had been fooled at all. Dmitri stood and handed Laura one of the only 2 weapons they would be armed with, their doctored nutrient shots. The usual sustenance they contained, however, had been removed to make room for their homemade roofie cocktails, or at least the closest facsimile they could create without actually having any Rohypnol on hand. Instead, each injector was repurposed with the entire supply of fentanyl, promethazine, and diphenhydramine they had on hand. In theory, it was both a non-lethal and quick-acting solution to possible aggression, which should put a man 3 times the size of Dmitri down for the count. It was hard to say how long they would be unconscious, but all they really had to do was get the men behind bars. They could decide what to do with them later. Laura stood behind him, keeping her hand on the shoulder of Dmitri's flight suit as they made their way through the capsule's door and into the short decompression tunnel which led into the larger world of Olympus. Unlike Dmitri, who seemed solid as a rock, her legs were weak and shaky from sitting in zero gravity for so long, as well as being unable to see her footfalls now that gravity had returned. They shared a moment of legitimate concern while waiting for the tunnel to decompress once the capsule was sealed off. It remained unspoken, but they both knew that if Rukia had lost the station's controls to Nick and Alex, this would have been their ideal opportunity to see to it that they didn't make it aboard. If they had really regressed to the primitive point of being cold-blooded killers, then now was the time to get it done without dealing with the actual blood, cold or otherwise. 2.5 very long minutes later, they were able to breathe a combined sigh of relief as the door to Olympus slid open. Rukia came through for them. Bay 6 was large to say the least. not designed for receiving personnel. It was crammed with robotic assembly line loaders and unloaders, as well as a lot of empty space. It made sense for Rukia to have them come this way if they were trying to be discreet, but it wasn't the easiest route to navigate with a blind woman in tow. Not to mention that they had really been hoping to see the lockers they would have found in the docks made for receiving crew. They were both anxious to get out of their flight suits, which, no longer free of gravity, had become quite cumbersome. Taking longer than he'd hoped, but quicker than he expected, Laura and Dmitri found themselves before the enormous set of electric sliding doors that let them into an equally large hallway which would, in turn, open into one of the station's main arteries. They kept a steady pace toward the doorway until the motion sensor slid the barrier aside, when Dmitri came to an abrupt, unanticipated stop which sent Laura smacking into his back. His body felt rigid. "What is it?" Laura whispered from behind him. "Two men. Waiting. Them, I guess." Dmitri did not lower his voice, which seemed to imply that they had not been made. "Be ready." She knew exactly what he meant, and clutched the tranquilizer in her hand ready to depress the button at a breath's notice. They stood quietly for several long seconds before he spoke again, this time much quieter than before. "They're not doing anything. Just sitting there on the floor next to the door." "Do they see us?" "I thought so, but maybe not." Laura wasn't sure what to do with that, and "Is there another way around them?" was the best she could offer. She was more than at any point before infuriated with her inability to contribute more to the situation. Hell, she would have been happy just not being a detriment. Keenly aware that Dmitri would take responsibility for not just his own safety, but hers as well. If something were to happen to him because he was trying to save her, well, it was another one of those thoughts that needed to be packed away somewhere in the deep, dark corner it would share with Mike and Kevin. "No, it's the only way through. One is moving. I think he may see." Dmitri went quiet, and then Laura could hear another man's voice coming from not too far ahead. "No. No fucking way. Who the hell are you?" There was genuine shock in the man's voice. Or perhaps insanity. And the next few moments came in a rapid flurry of frenzied activity. She could hear the man scramble to his feet and run headlong towards them while screaming, "I don't believe it. You're not real." There was a thud from all three men, as one of them made contact, sending Laura to the floor while Dmitri seemed to be wrestling with the attacker. "You're real! You're real! You're fucking real!" The crazy man cried over and over as Dmitri struggled to subdue him. There was no way she could tell, but from the Russian's grunts, he may have been losing. Laura struggled to get back to her feet and still kept a firm grip on the injector when she heard the other man call out from the end of the hallway. "It's open, Alex! You have to come now!" She did her best to try and target the second man so that they wouldn't be able to double-team Dmitri, and was going to put herself between them as best she could when the struggling astronauts made contact with her once again, sending all three of them to the floor this time. Somehow she found herself atop the sweating, panting madman, and with a deftness she hadn't imagined possible with her blindness, she plunged the tranquilizer into his neck. Almost instantly he ceased moving, and his breathing became calm and even. It had worked. "Dmitri?" she whispered, and from beneath her, he replied, "Wrong guy," was all he managed to gasp, and she suddenly realized that she was feeling the cosmonaut's flight suit on her palms. Damn it, straight to hell. She had injected Dmitri. She was trying to help, wanted to help, but it had all been so disorientating. She could only hope that he wouldn't blame her later. Assuming there was a later. There was no time for guilt in that moment, however, as her mind calculated the math equation of what two crazy guys plus one her would equal. Laura climbed over his sleeping form as gently as she could, only to fall over once again on yet another unconscious body. Dmitri had apparently gotten his shot in after all, and crazy guy number one was out cold as well. While that was a good thing, she supposed it made her feel twice as bad about drugging the man that had been keeping her alive. If she had only left well enough alone, he would have been fine, and they would still have another shot for the second psycho. Once she finally found her feet, which was no easy task, Laura had absolutely no sense of her bearings. She might as well have been back in space for the ocean of darkness she was swimming in. No idea what direction her assailant would come from. every nerve tight, every hair standing on end. She battled to keep her breathing slow and steady, if for no other reason than not to overpower the ability to hear her immediate environment. Locating the remaining aggressor by sound was already hard enough, with her heartbeat pounding in her ears like a jackhammer. She didn't need to add hyperventilation into her growing list of impairments. Her muscles screaming in agony beneath the weight of the flight suit. They could barely maintain the unrelenting tension they were being kept in. Despite what she thought to be a heightened sense of awareness, when he grabbed her shoulders from behind, it caught her completely off guard, and she screamed like 8-year-old Laura screamed when Freddy Krueger jumped on the screen for the first time. It was a cry of pure, unabashed horror, and the fear only got worse as he began to drag her down the hall. The most terrifying thing of all was that, no matter how strong an effort she wanted to put into fighting him, she was no match for his strength. Being out of 0G for less than an hour, and given everything she had already encountered in such a short time, her body was in no condition to challenge him. The man said nothing as he drug her, slightly squirming, and it seemed he had gone a considerable distance. They had obviously made it into Olympus's main hall, but she had no idea where he was taking her. After several nightmarish minutes of feeling like a fly being pulled away by a spider, he seemingly found a place to his liking, and after hearing a door slide shut behind them, Laura found herself being lowered into a seat. The man left her there, and she could hear him rummaging through things on the far end of the room. She considered making a run for it, but the futility of the act, which was likely to be more comical than successful, kept her in place. Before too long, his heavy breathing was back, and he returned with a metal tray of clinking items. Weapons? With fear and exhaustion playing tag with her psyche, a quick snippet of her wedding vows shot through her mind like oddly timed lightning, and Laura knew it was time to speak now or forever hold her peace.
What?
Her voice was dry and cracked. The little saliva she had a thick paste.
What are you doing to me?
There was no part of her that wanted to know the answer. The question was really just a last-ditch attempt at conversation, in the highly unlikely scenario that she could talk her way out of not dying, or at least not being tortured before she did. The man was quiet for a moment, and Laura hoped he was reconsidering whatever perverse avenues he planned to go down. Finally, he gave a long guttural sigh, sounding nearly as tired as she was, and spoke. I'm going to try to save your life. And mine while we're at it. The man's voice was deep, with a hair of British inflection, reflecting his nearly 30 years removed from the English territories. But for now, we're going to start by having a look at your eyes, getting you out of that Zoom bag. This was not what she was expecting, and it put her off her second line of conversation completely, which was to start begging for her life. And since I answered your question, he continued, I'd appreciate it if you'd answer one of mine. Exactly who the hell are you? And how the hell did you get here, miss? I guess that's 2 questions. Given that nothing else in the last 4 days had been remotely close to normal, it didn't really come as too much of a surprise to see the trend continue. She was confused, to be sure, but more than that, she was relieved. Not being tortured and killed in the depths of space, where they say screaming isn't heard terribly well, put her mind at ease considerably. I'm astronaut Laura Hillman, and I got here on the Daedalus with your new commander, Dmitri Kaspersky. After another moment of silence pondering her unseen companion, blurted out, Psycho bitch. And Laura flinched instinctively. The man put his hand on her knee. Perhaps to comfort her, she nearly fell out of her seat trying to pull away. Suddenly, quite wary of her imminent safety again. I'm sorry. He apologized several times over as sincerely as he could. I didn't mean to scare you. I wasn't. He sighed. Listen, I'm Nick Geary. You can call me Nick. I'm the medical officer on board the Olympus, until the crew gets... Nick trailed off, realizing his own mistake. Well, I'm the medical officer. If you'll let me, I'd like to take a look at your eyes and see if we can't get you fixed up. After that, we need to get you changed into some real clothes. And as much as I hate to be a pain, we probably need to do these things at an expedient pace. I don't think it's wise for us to stay here too long. Every time she thought she was beginning to grasp the situation, it just went right out the window. Her head was swimming in confusion. I don't understand, Nick. We were told that you had taken control of the station and were denying access to the Daedalus. We thought you were there too. I don't know, do something to us.
We were only trying to defend ourselves.
Nick's response was a dry chuckle that didn't sound like real laughter. Well, we were told that the Daedalus never made liftoff before Earth before, you know. The doctor reached for Laura's bandage, and this time she didn't flinch or pull away. It was due more to her being captivated by his words than her no longer being afraid of him, however. It was hard to fully trust anyone when you couldn't read their face. After a brief inspection, the man who claimed to be the station's doctor agreed with Dmitri's earlier assessment of solar retinopathy, as well as the cosmonaut's confidence in its ability to be treated. This was very welcome news given the intensity of the distracting flashing that flooded her visual senses while the bandage was off. The intense light of the central medical bay playing havoc with her optical nerves until Nick reapplied a new bandage, bringing back the merciful darkness. Nick took a swab to the inside of her mouth for Laura's DNA and fed the sample into one of the most expensive pieces of machinery on the entire OSS. It was a one-of-a-kind bioprocessor, with a 16-digit number as its only ID, but which its makers had affectionately dubbed Prometheus, for its ability to restore life to humanity, and perhaps even achieve immortality. Prometheus, unimaginable for most of humanity's tenure, was science fiction become science, creating synthetic stem cells on a nanoscopic level, which could combine the specific DNA or RNA to create cures for nearly every conceivable ailment from the common cold to cancer to 5th-degree burns. We honestly thought we were the last two people left. Nick gently patted her head like she was made of fine china, while they waited on the amazing machine, and she could hear the reverence in his voice. I'm really glad you made it here. I don't know how you did it, but I'm really glad you did. It took a remarkably short amount of time for Prometheus, with some specifically inputted instructions, to produce the solution which, once painlessly injected, would reduce Laura's healing period from several months to a day or two. Nick helped her get out of her flight suit, clean up and change into better suited clothes, and Laura, beyond the point of modesty, let him. It had nothing to do with her being blind or his being a doctor either. Given the circumstances, it just didn't matter. They spoke as she changed, and she kept getting the impression that she wasn't moving nearly quick enough. Nick's increased cadence and high-rising intonation gave every word a thinly veiled sense of urgency, and without seeing facial expressions, it was the only way she had to read him. He explained that Alex had not been trying to attack Dmitri at all, but had slipped into a state of mental delirium and wanted nothing more than to verify their reality with his own sense of touch. The situation escalated quickly between the two men, and it was unfortunate for them all the way it turned out. Apparently, the strain of the last few days had been too much for Olympus's main engineer, and he had snapped long before the Daedalus made port. It hadn't helped any that the two men had been led to Base 6 by a false alarm touting blockage in a ventilation shaft, and then trapped there for the last 2 days without food, water, or a toilet of any kind. You can bet your ass there's some blockage in the shaft now, Nick joked, and had she not been standing nearly naked, it would have qualified as TMI. But instead it produced a real chuckle from both of them. Astronaut Geary was somewhat crude, with the mouth of a sailor, but she could tell, by the time she had been clean, an OSS jumpsuit on, that she really liked the man. He didn't seem to have much of a filter between his mind and his mouth, not mincing words in the least, but he seemed to be a straight shooter, which was part of what she loved about Dmitri so much, and Mike. Once she had her boots laced up, he was insisting that they leave the medbay, that they were most likely being watched. Laura refused to budge this time without some answers first. Where were they going? Why were they running? Who were they running from? On top of all that, she was demanding that they go back and help Dmitri. Yeah, they may have still been alive, but they couldn't just leave him passed out on the metal docking platform. And Alex too, for that matter. Nick could see her determination, and by her best guess, was probably too exhausted himself to drag her any further. With the frustration plainly evident in his voice and a sigh after every other sentence, Nick did his best to explain what he could. For starters, he didn't know where they were going, just that they had to keep going or risk being trapped in whatever room they happened to be in. More than 40 hours ago, he and Alex had contemplated trying to access the only real weapon aboard the OSS, a 9mm handgun locked in a safe in the commander's office. But the only way in was with a numeric code, only known by the acting commander. The idea had been nothing more than a tease to them, but Laura made a mental note. Dmitri would know that code. It was another reason they needed to go back and get him. If not sooner, then definitely later. Nick paused, and promised more answers if they could just start moving to a new location. Any new location. Laura reluctantly agreed and let him lead her, hand in hand, out of the med bay and toward the housing units. It was his contention that, being some of the only areas without cameras, if they could get into one of the apartments unseen, they could finally rest and formulate some sort of plan. He repeatedly stressed that the need for stealth was important, but she could only be so covert, shuffling along at his side and slightly behind. Nick held her left hand while she traced the cool metallic wall with her right. She tried to work through the conundrum in her head, and to her, their antagonist couldn't have been more obvious. "Commander Milner," she said, her voice just above a whisper. Without slowing his pace, Nick looked over his shoulder at her. "What about her?" He shared her hushed tone, and Laura found that she actually preferred it in her current state of blindness. There was something about the tone and volume of the words that came her way which affected her ability to process them properly. Having to rely solely on an auditory palette for the world to color itself had created unique and surprising effects on the way her brain was rewiring itself. But this was hardly the time for scientific analysis. For that reason alone, she hadn't even begun to wonder why all the abstract hums, beeps, whirs, and other background noises that made up the station seemed to drift through her mind as vibrant colors, instead a cacophonous kaleidoscope of Olympus's soundtrack. It made her dizzy, if she let herself focus on it. "That's who we're running from. Commander Milner. I bet she went off the deep end, like Alex except worse. She deceived all three of you and tricked you into doing exactly what she wanted you to do. I mean, I haven't got it all figured out yet, but it's something like that, right?" This didn't seem to halt Nick momentarily, and just as she was sure he was about to confirm her suspicions, he said, "Are you hungry?" Offbeat and random seemed to be the man's forte, and Laura's mouth literally dropped open. In point of fact, however, she wasn't. It would be another 12 hours at least before her body would be ready to start accepting solid foods again. "I can't eat. I just boarded. Didn't you say you were the medical officer?" She was teasing with her jab. Under the current circumstances, anyone could be forgiven for a large degree of scatterbrain. "Of course," he agreed. "However, I'm hungry." As if on cue, his belly rumbled in confirmation. "I helped myself to a nutrient shot back in the med, but we hadn't eaten in a couple days. I'm going to need a little something." Laura had no great alternate plan to propose, so she simply shrugged her shoulders as if to say, "Whatever," and allowed him to adjust their course accordingly. They shuffled along quietly together for some distance before Nick finally revealed what had been troubling his mind. "Commander Milner." His voice was soft and low and conveyed a somber seriousness. "Made sure that everyone called her Jill. She was unlike anyone else you'd ever meet. She was a pioneer, and in my personal and professional opinion, she could have been one of the greatest deep space astronauts of all time. The commander was something of a hero of mine. I would have given my life for hers without deliberation." The anguished pain she heard at the edges of his sentences sounded like it might break into sobs at any moment, and she totally understood when he needed the time to collect himself. Within a few minutes, they found themselves in Kitchen C, just outside of Cafeteria 47, otherwise labeled the Rainbow Room Bar and Grill. Grabbing a menu and reading it aloud as they made their way back to the meagerly supplied shelves, Nick's mouth began watering for something significant. But he would have felt like a hypocrite if he had taken the time to fry a steak or whip up some bacon and eggs when he had pressed her so hard about their mobility while she was struggling to get out of the modified spacesuit. She was inclined to agree. Instead, he pocketed several of the NASA-distributed granola bars, which were designed somewhere underground by DARPA, and tore into one immediately. Laura was quite familiar with the bars herself, having on more than one occasion brought them back home to Mike and Kevin, who had liked them a lot more than she did. They didn't taste bad, with their genetically engineered oats, synthetic chocolate, and hundreds of chemicals designed to improve production, however. By her recollection, the ones from Walmart were worse. While slowly sipping her water, Laura stood and listened to him lip-smack his way through two of the questionable health food bars, and she couldn't help but to think about her commander again. "Everything a growing cosmonaut needs to become big and strong," she said to herself more than anything. It did earn a from Nick, whose mouth was too full to say anything else. "Oh, it's just something Dmitri liked to... You know what? Never mind." Now was not the time for nostalgia. Once she felt certain that the expert's mouth was empty enough to speak, she put a little more pressure on what she knew was already a sore spot.
So Nick, Commander Milner, you got so upset because of what she's done, right? I mean, you would have laid down your life for her and now she's trying to kill you. Believe me, the hellish irony isn't lost on me. I can understand how painful that must be.
Laura waited patiently for Nick to respond, hoping for some continuation of the story. There were still so many questions that needed answering, not the least of which was, where the hell was Rukia in all of this? She had been wary to bring up the subject of her friend since the last time they heard from her. She painted quite the picture of opposition between herself and Nick in particular. As she waited, his unspoken seconds turned into minutes, and the longer it stretched, the more uncomfortable she began to feel. She would have given anything to see his face. There was no way for her to know exactly how much time had passed before Nick cleared his throat and broke the silence, or that he had been spending those minutes fighting to keep his emotions in check. But it was long enough that she would have said something herself, had he not beaten her to it.
You've got it wrong, Mrs. Hillman.
Laura, she corrected him.
Laura's fine.
It wasn't so much that she felt the current situation dictated less formality, which it did, but rather a case of her really not wanting to hear her last name, Hillman, said aloud. It was the name she took from her husband and shared with her child, and unfortunately, she might never be able to hear it again without thinking of them both involuntarily. It was yet another unanticipated idiosyncrasy in the brave new world that was the rest of her life.
Laura. Right, of course.
Nick agreed before releasing his 100th sigh in the last hour.
There's no really easy way to say this, so I guess I'll just say it. The commander is...
Nick didn't get to finish his sentence, or if he did, she was unable to hear it. Without warning, a vibrating alarm filled the room, echoing off the kitchen's metal walls and creating the effect of 2 or even 3 sets of competing digital beeps. It was accompanied by flashing red emergency lights she was unable to see, and when Nick spoke again, he had to do so at very nearly the top of his lungs.
"It's a lockdown," he screamed. "She's found us. We have to go now."
Grabbing her hand, he jerked her towards the door with significantly more force than he meant to, almost sending her to the floor again. As difficult as it had been trying to navigate her environment without the benefit of sight, it was unimaginably worse now that her hearing was being taken away as well. The simple act of just placing one foot in front of the other became a Herculean task, and Laura allowed herself to be pulled more than progressing by her own volition. One foot shuffling behind the other, she prayed she wouldn't trip over anything, including her own feet. Well aware that she wasn't being expedient enough, it didn't help when Nick called out something from in front of her, most of which was lost to the audio assault. All she was able to make out was,
"Need to hurry and trapped for good."
She felt like she had a pretty good idea of what he was trying to get across. They made it out of the kitchen just before the doors sealed behind themselves, and the blaring echoes behind them apparently locking the process. Part of the way through the rainbow room before the familiar alarm erupted again. The open space and linen-draped walls of the dining area absorbed a large portion of the mentally grating blasts, allowing her to think and walk a little straighter than she had in the confined spaces of the kitchen. Moving much quicker as a result, the motley pair easily made it out of the lounge. Oddly enough, however, the alarm stopped as soon as they did, ceasing the exact moment they crossed the threshold. The door didn't close and lock, and they stopped just outside of it.
"She's fucking with us,"
Nick concluded, and after a moment,
"I need you to hang tight for just a second." "What? What the hell are you talking about?"
She didn't sound happy.
"I dropped my bag. I have to run back in and get it."
"What bag?"
"I had a bag of some supplies. Food, medicine, the like. I've been grabbing stuff as we went, and it must have fallen off my shoulder back there. I think I see it. It's not far. It'll only take a moment to run back and grab it."
"What about the door?" Laura asked. "The alarm?"
"That alarm is nothing more than a 20-second warning of a lockdown, even if she shouldn't be able to override it. If it goes off again, I should have more than enough time. I'll be quick."
He pulled softly and reluctantly. She let his hand slip away. She couldn't have really stopped him anyway. As hard as it was to accept, the fiercely independent woman she had been was having to come to terms with her current state of vulnerability, and it was having to do it so damn fast that it probably wasn't good for her psyche.
The state of dependence she had been forced into was bringing back emotions not felt since early childhood, and random thoughts that were better suited keeping their distance. "Don't leave me, Daddy. I'm scared of the dark without you." She followed his hustling progress as well as she could with his offering. "Almost got it. Here it is, and I'm coming back now," to aid her as he went. Laura could hear his heavy breathing again once he was only a few feet away, but he never quite made it back to her side. The door to the Rainbow Room's main entrance did close and lock without warning, sealing off the space between them with an airtight and soundproof glass door. If she hadn't lost the ability to see, the sight of Nick screaming and pounding on the other side of the door, eyes wild and panicked, would have probably made her sick. Instead, her only awareness was of the low vibrating hum of Concourse Delta and the complete and utter helplessness felt in the pit of her stomach. It was 1979 again, and all she wanted to do was pull the sheets over her head to hide from the monsters under her bed and in her closet. Laura could feel herself regressing exponentially, and she was getting dangerously close to the point of not coming back. "Laura," a voice broke through her psychological swan dive. A familiar voice, and the joy she felt upon hearing it played a crucial part in holding back the madness. There was still fear that it may have been an auditory hallucination, and when she heard, "Oh God, Laura, it is you," her chest swelled as she tried to keep her ailing eyes from producing any tears. "Rukia," she cried towards the direction of the voice, and then the women were clutching each other in a warm embrace. It seemed like a lifetime since they had been together face to face, and yet neither of them wanted to let go. "I was so worried about you, Rukia. I thought maybe Commander Milner had done something to you," Laura whispered as they hugged. "I'm sorry, Laura. I couldn't say anything until I got you away from Nick. I've been monitoring you guys and waiting for a chance to isolate you. You have no idea how lucky you are." Laura pulled back and shook her head. "I don't understand. Nick was trying to help." "No, Laura, you don't understand." Rukia's voice had something of an edge to it. "I don't know what Geary said or did to you, but he's a master liar. If I were to tell you what he had planned for all of us, it would sicken you. This man is a lunatic. I probably saved your life." That was so hard to believe. Nothing anyone was saying seemed to make any lick of sense. Laura made a half-hearted attempt to sort the drastically different accounts, and she remembered the most important thing. "Dmitri. We have to go back and help Dmitri." "Yeah," Rukia agreed. "We do. I already moved Wang to a secure location, but Commander Kaspersky will still need our assistance. I managed to get him on a stretcher, but haven't had a chance to move him. I thought it was more important to stay close to you and Geary, watch for my opportunity. I don't know what I would have done if he had hurt you." Laura could hear the sincerity in her voice, and it did nothing but further her cloud of ability to judge the situation. If she could just get a clear picture of exactly what was happening on Olympus, it would make dealing with it a whole hell of a lot easier. "Where's Commander Milner in all of this?" Jill Milner felt like the missing piece of the puzzle. "In the last communication you said she'd been put, in the brig? Is she still... can we find her?" "Definitely." Rukia squeezed Laura's hands, which she'd still been holding. "I got her out of lockup shortly after I was able to free myself. We can go see the commander right now." Not what Laura was expecting. The revelation came as a genuine shock, and despite the other woman's words, she couldn't stave off the feeling of mistrust she had for the OSS's should-be former commanding officer. Maybe it was just the fact that she was the only crew member Laura had yet to encounter, but ever since the first signs of chaos aboard the station made themselves known, she stayed behind the scenes. It seemed logical to presume that she was the one pulling the strings behind the crew's animosity. She was the commander after all. "Okay, let's do that." Laura was still wary, but she needed to know. Commander Milner, or Jill, if she believed Nick, could either be a strong ally, if there was a schism in power here, or she will have found the mastermind behind all of their current troubles. Rukia said okay, and Laura let her lead the way, making better progress than she did with Nick's insistence on her sneaking, but amazed, nonetheless, that her muscles allowed her to continue on at all. The fear of dropping at any second and passing out from exhaustion was a legitimate concern. For that reason, more than any other, Laura remained relatively quiet as they went. The majority of her cognitive abilities spent concentrating on continuing to place one foot in front of the other and staying upright. Rukia remained relatively distracted as well. the tablet which she kept constantly in hand, consuming most of her attention with its readings on all of Olympus's operations. The current situation had obviously forced her into a role with a lot more responsibility than that of a communications officer, and it seemed the station only continued to function properly through her diligence. At least that's the way it sounded as she spent the majority of her time tapping away at the touchscreen. It would have been impressive as hell if Laura had a spare synapse to fire off a thought about it. Laura didn't bother to ask where Rukia was leading her, and Rukia never bothered to tell her. In her current state of exhaustion, bouncing from one frantic situation to another, she had given herself fully to the notion of now being safe. Having been found by her old friend, learning that Dmitri was no longer laying on cold steel, and that both Alex and Nick, dangerous or not, were contained and alive was incredibly cathartic. It gave her well-worn adrenal glands a much-deserved break. They weren't required to actually walk, but for a short distance before Rukia was steering them into a mobility chamber, a glorified elevator that ran horizontally as well as vertically. It was probably a good thing too, as even with the transportation, it took nearly 20 minutes to arrive at their destination. By the time Rukia was sliding her onto the hard metal stool, Laura was so grateful to take the weight off her feet that it felt as good as a lazy boy. The stool was attached to a table which Laura surmised to be a dining area. She put her head down on her arms like a preschool nap time. All she wanted was to sleep. The second she quit fighting it, she was out. When she finally came back to, her sleeve was wet with drool, and it felt like it had probably been a significant amount of time. Much like her time in the capsule, however, the ability to properly detect and measure increments of time was impaired beyond the point of any degree of reliability. Her body's internal clock had always been a source of consistency, and it came as a shock to discover how closely tied it was with her ability to monitor an actual clock. Outside of the steady hum of a few electric devices or appliances, the room was completely silent. "Rukia," she called out, her voice echoing off the cold walls. The acoustics sounded very similar to the kitchen she had been in earlier with Nick. "I'm here," Rukia replied from somewhere across the room. "You're okay." Laura was still tired and weak for the first time in a week. Her stomach was showing some interest in food. "How long was I asleep?" She could hear Rukia coming closer as she replied. "Not too long, but you were out good. I figured you'd probably need to recharge a bit." She wasn't wrong about that. "You were asleep just as long enough for me to take care of Giri." Any residual fogginess was quickly blown away, and Laura shook her head. "What do you mean, take care of? What did you do to Nick?" "Relax." Rukia plopped down in the seat next to hers and put her hand on her friend's shoulder. "It's all okay now." Her words were steady and even, and did a great job at conveying their honesty. "Giri and Wang have both been processed. Now we're all on the same page. They won't be any more struggling for power, only survival. We can take care of Commander Kaspersky together, and then the future can be, well, whatever we want it to be." Julia had no idea what the Asian woman was referring to when she spoke of the men being processed, but it could have been any number of things from a decontamination routine to binding agreement. Regardless, the fact that they would all be getting along again was great news, except, wait a second. It surprised her that it took her too long for the thought to reveal itself, but given the strenuous ordeal her mind had been made to endure, it probably shouldn't have. "What about Commander Milner? Julie, I thought we were going to see her." Rukia sighed and took her hand off Laura's shoulder. "Listen," her voice took on a somber tone. "I wasn't completely honest with you. Thing is, I didn't want to lay too much on you at one time." "Rukia," Laura tried to match her even quality, not yet sure how to play the coming seconds. "I think now would be the time to go ahead and lay it all on me. I appreciate your concern, but I'm not a child you need to protect." There were a few moments of silence as Laura allowed Rukia time to consider her words, except it wasn't complete silence. Beneath the electric hums and even their breathing, there was a small gritty sound Laura knew very well. Having heard it from her father for her entire life until his death, she knew that Rukia was grinding her teeth together. She also knew that it was generally a result of stress. "Okay," Rukia began. "Here's the truth. Commander Milner had been forced into the brig, as I stated before. But what I didn't tell you was that she committed suicide while she was in there. By the time I was able to get to her, she was gone. It was too late.
She took a moment to swallow the lump in her throat before continuing.
It had been too much for her. The bombs on Earth and the mutiny had her on the edge. And then when she was told that the Daedalus never made liftoff, it just pushed her over, I guess.
Laura understood why Rukia hadn't wanted to tell her. It was tragically sad, and even though she had never met the woman, she could see how the news of someone killing themselves due to enduring horrible circumstances, and then learning of new ones, might not be the best story to share with someone who was also enduring horrible circumstances. Rukia had chosen the temporary sin of omission over diluting what was already a thin morale.
Okay, Rukia. I'm so sorry.
She was, too. It had to have been devastating. Laura put her arms around her friend and the two women embraced for several seconds before Rukia quickly pulled away.
Oh shit.
Something at her attention.
What is it?
Laura asked.
I don't know. An alarm in engineering. E-level. It could be nothing, but I need to check it out real quick. Now listen, give me 30 minutes or so and I'll be back. And then we can talk about what we were going to.
Okay. Laura nodded her head.
And then get Dmitri. Yeah.
Rukia agreed.
Add Nick and Alex too? Yeah.
Rukia confirmed.
They'll be there too. I have to go, Laura. Try to get some rest.
She stood and quickly made her way out of the room, calling back to her just before the door slid shut.
I'm really glad you're with me.
It put a smile on Laura's face, and she put her head back on the table and spread her arms out with a yawning stretch. The fingertips of her right hand made contact with an unusual object, and stretching further, she took hold of something. Odorless and firm, in a vacuum-sealed plastic. It wasn't completely solid, but felt tender and wet. If she didn't know any better, she would have sworn it was a large, meaty steak. The problem with that, however, was that there should have been little to no meat aboard the station until, and if, the Aryan 6 made contact. And it definitely wouldn't be just lying around on the table like this. Rukia must have had it out for her next meal. Satisfied with the probable logic of that possibility, Laura would have to let it go too, had her hand not encountered a second package. Differently proportioned, but similar in consistency to the first. She carefully slid down 2 seats until she found herself directly in front of a small pile of the mystery packages. Working them through her hands one at a time and racking her brain in the world's worst guess the Christmas present game. She finally came across one she could recognize, and it made her throw up a little in her mouth. It was a human foot. The horror that gripped her as she held the wrapped appendage in her hands would not allow her to drop it, even though that was all she wanted to do. Her mind seemed as frozen as her body, and the only thought she could produce was, "This can't be real," which repeated over and over. It took a considerable mental exertion to free her hands off the offensive object, and Laura struggled to consider her options. Was she really just going to sit here and wait on Rukia without knowing for sure? There was always the possibility, albeit unlikely, that she had misconstrued and misinterpreted what she thought she just felt, but she had to know for sure. Reluctantly, she slowly peeled away the gel-infused bandage from her eyes and tried blinking several times. Remarkably, and with complete thanks to the Prometheus injection, they were already significantly better. There was a slight burning sensation and a large black spot that filled the center of her vision, but the flashing was gone, and if she concentrated, she could make out the items on the edges of her periphery without actually looking directly at them. It took several mind-numbing minutes of practice and an onsetting headache before she could turn herself at the proper angle to discern the pile of packaged meat. And yes, it was meat. It was identifying a woman's hand that put her in motion. It was definitely time to get the hell out of there. Scanning the room, and in turn locating the exit, proved to be even more difficult. Every time she thought she saw something useful, her instinct was to look at, and then obscure whatever it was. It was frustrating to no end, but it was better than being blind. Sorting out her environment was time-consuming, but it eventually came together. She was in another kitchen, a very large kitchen, which seemed to spread out endlessly. She had navigated past a couple of preparation tables before stumbling across a large wooden butcher's block, drenched in bright red blood, which she could only take in at a cockeyed angle. There was something with stained metal buried in the wood, but the persistent instinct to look right at it kept her from fully distinguishing its form.
it was disturbing nonetheless, and her best guess was that it was a meat cleaver. Walking sideways to navigate her way around the gory table, she nearly lost her balance when her foot slipped in a slicked puddle of red. Even with her poor tracking abilities, the sickening trail of blood was easy to follow, leading past the pile of soaked and shredded OSS uniforms and straight to the vacuum sealing machine, where it began to dry and become sticky. A pile on the large table next to the machine, designed to maintain the freshness of food for the long haul of deep space, nearly took her breath away. Segmented parcels made it impossible to equate to human form, but the sheer mass of it dictated that it had to be more than one person. Laura's stomach lurched violently, and she was suddenly grateful there was nothing for it to produce. Had Rukia done this? Was she looking at the remains of Alex, Nick, and Jill? It seemed inconceivable, and was at such odds with everything she knew as sanity. Spinning on her heels and nearly slipping in blood once again, Laura decided she had lingered long enough when the door, which she had yet to locate, slid open somewhere to her left. She cocked her head and did her best to target the direction, but could make out very little beyond the fact that someone had entered.
Laura, don't freak out.
Rukia was back, and she was taking slow, deliberate steps in Laura's direction.
You need to let me explain.
With each step her friend took toward her, Laura would take one in the opposite direction, keeping her neck strained at the uncomfortable angle required to pinpoint the movement.
This is just about simple math. Without the supplies from the Ariane 6, 6 people would have survived for no longer than 3 weeks. That's it. 3 weeks. And then we all die horrible deaths anyway.
Laura nearly fell over a plate stand, knocking the top 2 or 3 to the floor with a crash, and for a split second, lost Rukia completely. Fortunately, she didn't seem to be trying to take advantage and continued with the slow pace of both her words and her steps, allowing Laura plenty of time to locate her again.
However, if we supplement our resources with 800 pounds of high-protein meat and cut that number down to 2, then, well, we can make it. We only have to survive for 2 years before it would be safe enough to take the Daedalus back to Earth. I've worked this problem through several times. Laura, you have to believe me. There's only one way for 2 people to make it out of this alive.
Still backing away and sickened to her core, Laura didn't know how to reply. The reality and full implications of Rukia's words were slowly seeping into her realm of acceptance, one dreadful thought at a time. Nick said Rukia told them the Daedalus didn't make it. Rukia said Jill killed herself from hearing the same thing. It was Rukia all along. She was responsible for all their deaths. Laura's faith in human nature was being torn away, one painful strip at a time, and she could feel the qualities that made her the person she was going with it. No matter how this situation resolved itself, she would be a fundamentally different person afterwards. Then there was the big question. Why hadn't Rukia tried to kill her? When she said 2 people, had she meant the 2 of them? If that was the case, then... Oh dear Lord, no.
2 people,
Laura blurted out, surprising even herself with the volume.
Rukia, did you kill them all? What about Dmitri? Did you kill Dmitri?
The combination of her forceful screams and still trying to keep Rukia's general vicinity in view sent Laura backwards, and she braced herself against a table to keep from tumbling over. As soon as she felt moisture on her hands, she knew which table she had grabbed. Too furious to be revolted, she held her bloody palms up in what she hoped was the right direction.
Is this his blood?
She screamed, again before pausing to let Rukia respond. Rukia sighed, and this time Laura could barely hear it over her own panting. Now that she was relying more on her eyesight again, her cochlea and eardrums were no longer pulling Superman duty.
Laura.
Rukia's voice sounded like she was talking to a small child who would barely understand the words.
I already told you. It's going to take 2 of us to process him. He's a big guy. Until he's processed, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to kill him. So he's alive,
Laura interrupted.
For now, yeah. The commander is still strapped down on a stretcher in Base 6.
Laura felt some sense of hope return, having gotten the answer she was least expecting. but it far from outweighed the shock she felt at Rukia's presumption.
And you honestly thought I was going to help you... what, kill him? Cut him up? Eat him? Are you out of your fucking mind?
Laura hoped she knew it was a rhetorical question because the woman was quite obviously as mad as the Hatter, sans the limericks and witty repartee.
I would rather die than do something like that, Rukia. I would have thought you'd know that. Well, Laura, that's always an option, but before you make that kind of decision, I think you should know all the facts. Facts?
Laura cried.
What bloody facts? The only fact I see is that you're a psychopath. As much a psychopath as the people responsible for killing my husband and child. You better hope there's not an afterlife because there's a special place in hell for you, you bitch.
Rukia's demeanor seemed unfazed by her outburst.
Laura, I know you're upset, but please hear me out.
She paused for a moment, and when Laura didn't interrupt, decided to continue.
The commander's being alive isn't just for freshness. I said 2 people, because it will take a minimum crew of 2 in order to maintain the Olympus. This is only even possible because of the work I've been doing since we lost contact with the Earth. The way I've adjusted the systems are very specific, and therefore, one of those crew members must be me. The other can either be you or the commander. And because I wanted it to be you, I wanted to let you decide. But be aware that this only works one way mathematically. Just in case you're thinking that Olympus could hold a crew of 3. Don't. It'll skew the numbers just enough to make the whole endeavor futile, and essentially, a waste of lives. For there to be meaning in any of this, it has to be 2 people. 2 people. 2 years.
Laura couldn't believe what she was hearing. Rukia sounded too calculating and articulate to be insane, but she was definitely a sociopath, ascribing no real value to any human life other than her own. It suddenly seemed odd that she had chosen Laura as her favorite based on what was now such ancient history, and knowing how little Rukia seemed invested in previous attachments.
You honestly believe Dmitri will help you to cut and eat me?
Laura knew Dmitri more than well enough to know that he would never go along with something like this. Rukia suddenly closed the distance between them in half, and Laura could do nothing but stagger and try to see her, which was hard to do without looking at her.
Well, here's the thing, Laura. I won't need his help to kill you or cut you up. You're not as sizable a job as he would be. Once it's just the commander and I who are left, well, I think you know he'll believe whatever I tell him, including the freak shipment of 4 sides of beef that came in with the last supply run. I don't know. Maybe I'll come up with something better. The point is, whatever it is, he'll believe me.
Laura was scared. She had lost everything that held any importance to her except Dmitri, and now she was being told that the only way she could live was if she lost him as well. All things considered, it made sense to just give up. If there was nothing left to live for, then why bother? Except, down deep, where the primal instincts and urges lived, she wanted to live. Beyond rationality and defying logic, she wanted to live, damn it. And it wasn't for the pursuit of happiness. That ship had sailed. It was that thing inside of her that told her she had to... What was it Rukia had said? Survive. Sliding her hands back onto the cutting table again, Laura began reaching out behind her as nonchalantly as she could before finding and taking hold of the cleaver's handle. She was only able to pull off the illusion because of the funky angle she was already standing at in order to keep Rukia somewhat targeted.
Okay,
Laura said.
I'll do it. I'll help you. Really?
Rukia sounded hopeful.
But you have to answer one question for me and be honest. Okay.
She nodded, still not noticing Laura's left hand gripping the dull end of the chopping device embedded in the wood grain tabletop.
Why me? You said you wanted it to be me, so why me?
Now that Rukia was closer, Laura could hear her grinding her teeth again, this time much louder than before. It was her tell. She was about to reveal something she didn't want to, which meant she was probably going to be telling the truth. Rukia had to believe they were beyond the point of lies now anyway. Laura hoped so, at least.
I chose you, Laura Hillman, because next to me, you have the smallest body size and caloric intake to provide maximum output efficiency. The odds of my survival are 12% better than you and the commander.
If there were any laughter left in Laura's soul, she would have laughed. She wanted to laugh. There was no doubt Rukia was telling the truth because it reflected her cold and calculating nature perfectly. She didn't choose Laura to be her last neighbor forever for any reasons of friendship or even familiarity. It really was a math equation to her where X equaled coworker and Y equaled TV dinner. And it really didn't matter who was which variable, as long as it came out to Z, her continued and extended existence. The answer wasn't exactly what Laura was expecting, but it was close enough to push her to the end of her own little calculation. Was her desire to live, despite the multitude of reasons not to, stronger than her desire to make sure that Rukia didn't? Was self-preservation greater than or lesser than the chorus of her bloodthirsty nerves screaming in unison to bury the blade somewhere deep in Rukia's skull? It, for damn sure, wasn't equal to. And Laura knew with complete certainty that the other woman's life needed to be ended. She shouldn't be alive for even another minute. Even if she were the very last human in existence, she would need to be put down, like a rabid dog. It was an act of mercy. That kind of sickness just shouldn't exist. Laura yanked on the meat cleaver's handle with every ounce of energy she had. In her mind, she saw the large cutting device sliding free from the wooden surface, then gliding through the air in one swift and fluid motion. It would make contact with Rukia long before she'd even registered an incoming attack. Maybe not a killing blow, but good enough to get the party started. A single lethal strike was a better death than she deserved anyway. The problem with all of that, however, is that the cleaver refused to budge. She yanked a second time, and, of course, by this point, it was painfully obvious what she was trying to do. The third time seemed like it might be the charm as the handle moved just a bit, and Laura turned her head to re-establish a bearing of her ex-friend. Inconveniently timed as it was, she was able to catch the movement before her nose took the worst part of Rukia's fist, shattering the bridge and sending her sprawling to the floor in a pool of other people's blood. Her face felt like it was on fire, except burning from within. Laura tried looking up through the red haze and could barely see Rukia straddled over her. The psychopath was so close to that black spot only concealed her face and chest, so Laura was able to easily detect the meat cleaver dangling from her right hand. Sure, after she loosened it up for her.
I'm not gonna lie, Laura. I'm a little disappointed,
Rukia expounded.
For some reason, I really thought you were going to see things my way. I thought we could... Well, I don't know what I thought. I guess it doesn't matter now.
She raised the cleaver in a striking position, and Laura held her hand up in front of her face, knowing full well it was a useless gesture.
I'll make sure the commander gives a eulogizing toast in your honor the first time we dine on your liver.
I'm sure it will be very moving. Laura couldn't see her face, but she could swear she heard a smile in that sick bitch's voice.
In the meantime, try not to fight this.
Rukia raised the blade over her head, began arcing it down with as much force as she could muster, which, given her already proven ability to butcher, was probably quite a lot. Laura prayed it would be quick and relatively painless, and she wondered if she would get to see Mike and Kevin again. That wasn't the same thing as acceptance. She didn't want to find out what happens when you die. As the blade slid through the air, it glinted the fluorescent kitchen lights on one of its only clean spots and momentarily completed her blindness. In that same instant, there was a hollow pop from across the room which made Laura think, of all things, of champagne open. In the back of her mind, Kevin's voice asked,
"Is it a special occasion, Mommy?"
Perhaps it was. Rukia suddenly lost her grip on the deadly cutlery, sending it flying from her hand and clinking away unseen. And Laura had no idea what had happened. Due to the flash of light in the ever-present blank spot, she was unable to see the look of astonished surprise on Rukia's face. Nor did she see the thin line of red that had begun to run down her cheek from the tiny hole in her temple. Laura remained frozen in her spot on the floor like a child waiting for an admonishment. For the several long seconds that Rukia continued to stand there, face burning, eyes stinging. She waited for some type of aggressive impact. The fight all but beaten from her, and it came as a complete shock when her tormentor tumbled down on top of her, crumpling into a mobile pile. Laura screamed and desperately tried to pull herself from beneath the lifeless body, much heavier than she would have imagined, while her hands and feet slipped in the blood. For one horrifying split second, she was convinced that it wasn't going to happen. And then Rukia's body was lifting itself off of her. No, it was being lifted. Another second later, she was too. The searing ache and pooled blood around her nose and eyes had her nearly blinded again. But she knew she was safe the moment she felt the strong arms wrap around her and lock her into their embrace. It was Dmitri, her commander, co-pilot, protector, and dear, dear friend, had promised to keep her safe no matter what, and somehow, he kept his promise. Held tightly in his arms and covered in blood, it was the only place in the universe that she wanted to be in that moment, and Laura found herself unable to hold back the torrent of salty tears, despite the acidic pain they brought with them. Seemingly, the roller coaster ride of emotions had come to an end, and it had cost her everything to ride. The relief that it was over, even for just that moment, was like nothing Laura had ever dreamed or desired. Over the next 12 hours, she passed in and out of consciousness. Dmitri had set her up in a med bay near Prometheus so that she could take hourly injections. Prognosis was 20/20 eyesight in 3 days, and broken nose healed in about a week. But the first few hours were obviously going to be the worst, and the pain medication kept her from asking any questions. At the 4th hour, after the most intense pain had passed and the opiate fog had subsided somewhat, she mustered the single word that covered her wide range of inquiries. How? I'm a big guy, Dmitri had chuckled. How long do you think I would stay unconscious? But, Laura pressed. She says she had you tied down. Dmitri laughed again, and Laura reflected on just how much she had missed that sound, and how close she had come to never hearing it again. I'm Dmitri Kapersky. His tone said that should be answered enough. Laura had always thought that she knew what that meant, but now, she hadn't known anything. The commander's reputation was one of legend, and one wouldn't have been faulted for thinking that it was, in large part, an exaggeration. Not that she ever had, but they would have been wrong. If anything, his lore was probably under-embellished. For Laura, at least, he was nothing short of a friggin' superhero. While gently cleaning and doctoring her wounds, Dmitri proceeded to tell her the story. I think we've got time, he said sarcastically. Rukia had strapped him to a medical stretcher, but given the number of distractions she was dealing with, neglected to remove the small utility knife from an exterior breast pocket of his dataless flight suit. Once free, it had taken him too long to get inside the security and surveillance systems to figure out what Rukia had been up to. From there, he went to the commander's office to retrieve the only firearm in Olympus from the safe, with a code that only he and the Commander Milner knew. He was the one that set off the false alarm that drew Rukia away in the first place. But then a real issue kept him from getting back to Laura as quickly as he wanted to. What about her failsafe? Laura asked. Rukia made changes to the OSS system so that only she could keep it running properly. Or so she said. It might have been BS like the rest of her lies, but should we be worrying about it? This didn't come as a surprise to Dmitri, who apparently already knew and didn't seem overly concerned about it. Kannagi was a bright officer. Very clever, but foolish to think that she could do anything that I couldn't undo. I helped design most of the critical systems on the station, and the complexity of Olympus is well beyond her. Frankly, if she had kept the station on the rotational path she had chosen, it would have torn itself apart in a few days. There was a reason I was chosen to be the first commander for a fully operational Olympus. I guess she wasn't as smart as she thought she was, Laura offered. Yeah, he agreed. She was a great astronaut and comms officer. Not so good with the engineering and engines. Even if she was the best in her field, there was still nothing she knew that I hadn't already taught to hundreds of others. There was nothing unique or special about her. Not like you. Laura pulled Dmitri close and held him tightly once again, so grateful for his being there. She was a special piece of shit, she whispered into his ear, bringing yet more of that laughter that was like a balm for her soul every time she heard it. That she was, he whispered back. I'm ashamed to say that she had me fooled. Don't beat yourself up over it. She had us all fooled. Dmitri nodded, and a grim expression came over his face. Laura had mixed feelings over it. It was never a look she wanted to see on his face. It was hard not to feel some joy in the fact that she could see it. There was still some blurriness and the fine details were obscured, but Prometheus had delivered on its promised miracles.
What is it, Dmitri?
She could tell that he was considering whether or not to reveal what was weighing on him, and decided that the concealment of information was coming to an end once and for all.
You don't get to decide what's for me to know and not for me to know anymore. It's just us. We have to tell each other everything. Do you understand?
His face went grim, indecision to solemn certainty. He knew she was right. Neither one of them had even bothered considering what it would be like living out the rest of their lives. But if it was just them, secrets would have to be a thing of the past. Okay, Dmitri began, and Laura could tell that the words were hurting him to say. The reason I didn't get back to you quicker, when I distracted Kannagi earlier, was because of an incoming transmission from... He sighed and shook his head. The Ariane 6. She'll be here in 10 hours. Laura's face ran pale with quiet shock and her eyes began to pool with fat tears, even though she was sure they had all run dry. The Ariane 6 and all her supplies had actually made it. Rukia Kannagi's horrific algebra was pointless. Not that her reason for murdering the people that trusted her was a good one in the first place, but now, even it had no merit. Her callous selfishness was the perfect cosmic reflection of the evil motivations that coaled the Earth with nuclear fire, and in the end, it proved to be just as meaningless. It was sickening. Rukia had known damn well that it was impossible to ride off the automated transfer vehicle without some time passing, as she claimed to have told her crew. And yet, she had begun to implement her cannibalistic plans within hours of the first bombs falling. It wasn't calculating. It was evil. After several minutes of stunned, silent sobbing, overwhelmed by the sadness of it all, Laura finally shook her head and asked,
Is this what we are as a species? Murderers, takers, destroyers? Is this what humanity is?
She paused to sigh, but it came out as a mournful moan instead.
Because I don't think I know anymore.
Dmitri put his hand to her chin and pushed her healing eyes to meet his own. We, you and I, Dmitri and Laura, Olympus, are what humanity is. Our species is whatever we decide to make it. Laura nodded in agreement, and in the coming days, weeks, months, and hopefully years, what we need to be is strong.